We have another talk today, this morning, a plenary session, and it's by Brenton. Barry is a professor as you can see right here, in fact, it's right here at St. John's University in Queens, New York. He comes here also with his wife and child, and I hope his wife is here, but I don't know if yes, she is. So please just raise your hand so we can all see you. Thank you. Okay. And what I would like you to think about is that he represents a very unique position, that St. John's University, where he is a professor of anthropology, also has a direct connection to the educational institutions of the Vatican. And so he commutes back and forth between the Vatican in a very special program that he runs for educating people from all over the world there that come there and then fan out through the rest of the world. So he has a very unique conception of what the issues are, and particularly the issues around what exists at that special program at the Vatican, where social justice is at the heart of it. And his specialty, of course, is food and nutrition. And so what we have is a unique synthesis on the topic of food sovereignty and environmental nutrition as a foundation of food justice and sustainable food systems. So this is a very unique presentation that, in a sense, extends what we've already been talking about in new ways. So I'm looking forward very much to hear from Barry about that. Thank you.
Good morning. Obviously, no connection to the Vatican is ever direct, so it's always indirect connections when we add to that. But I'll talk a little bit maybe later if I have time, sort of our work, particularly with Catholic Relief Services in the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, and how that links up as well to our graduate program. But for first, I'm an anthropologist, and Saul doesn't know this actually, but I thought I'd start out with a little peeky update, kind of roll us back to where we were yesterday. And the emphasis I wanted to bring up is Saul laid out this wonderful terminology of an ethnivore, particularly in the context of Piki, this very nutritious food, this life state of the Hopi in the desert, but the symbolism of the blue, the symbolism of the women who make it in their marriage, and this relationship between the biology and the culture behind that. But I wanted to add a little stress to those points. And one is that the Piki stones themselves, archaeologically, come about the same time we see the first iconography, the first symbols of the Kachina cult, which is the primary foundation of Hopi religion today, the Kachina spirits. And Piki stones, Kachina spirits, and that relationship also is bound together when we see this sort of development of Hopi culture from the past. You can see here about 1300 to 1600 AD. The other thing I wanted to bring up quickly is because Saul and I both have such a passion for corn. My students would say, "Can you talk about anything else about it?" I said, "How else can one see the world today, if not through thinking about corn?" And I wanted to bring up some questions came up about pellagra and hominy and things. I didn't want to digress too much, but just the fact that this was a horrible impact on American society, particularly the American South. It was a disease of poverty. Saul mentioned Joseph Goldberger's great work very early on. He hit it right on the nail. It went into perfect public health experiment. That's diet. Why did it take so long? Well, Saul did mention because a lot of factors in America, the American South, this is the early 20th century, not so long beyond the time of the Civil War, or the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression, however we refer to it now in this 150th year. But it was the fact that Goldberger not only came from the north, seen as a Yankee, but he's also seen as a Jew, a Jewish doctor, who didn't quite set well with the southern medical establishment. And part of the ignoring all of his research and work was based in that sort of that time period. Not to mention this is the time of the revving up the eugenics movement. And the idea of eugenics fit very well into why poor people have all these diseases, is because they pass it on to each other, right? And this notion of even our immigration laws, etc., that came about. But I just wanted to show this blog mortality, come back to the point I wanted to make, is particularly amongst women. that they died at a rate consistently double that of men. The morbidity rate for pellagra was up to 10 times higher for women than for men. So if Hopi women had anything at stake in making sure they were processing that PICU, they had a high stakes involved in their own nutrition and the old impact to avoid this disease of pellagra. And particularly interesting, if you look decade by decade in terms of the life cycle, and here's sort of a chart showing ages just for a 10-year period of mortality. And remember that morbidity rates were much, much higher than this, and so it came seasonally in the American South. But I want to point out that you see a rapid rise in rates, the age of energy, and beginning to decline as you move towards the age of menopause amongst women. You can see for men it's pretty much stable in terms of those mortality rates across the board. But for women, you see this curve. And what's interesting about that is we do know from experiments, clinical experiments, that actually estrogen blocks this tryptophan to niacin conversion that Saul mentioned briefly yesterday out of content. But a lot of our data niacin is gotten from the amino acid tryptophan. And that being blocked, specifically in a marginal diet, you find that being blocked, it's no doubt that you have a combination of not only the issues of sex biologically in terms of estrogen production, but I always like to think this is also a question of gender. Because we also know in the American South, the eating habits of women and families around the world, the notion of gender and food and nutritional status of women themselves, is heavily impacted by making sure that either the husband who may be working in this hot mills of the South, for example, or the children themselves are the first to get any kind of milk or any kind of more quality protein in the diet, the woman will be last. So I'm not saying it's a deterministic sex issue in terms of why women die that way, but I think it's a synergistic relationship between the biology of estrogen blocking the one major pathway you have to get niacin, which is not coming in the corn, because it's not processed, but also you have the impact ultimately coming from questions of gender and the woman's role in the family and her own eating habits with respect to their responsibility for not only food preparing, but the relationship to what she's eating herself. So I wanted to throw that out to all to sort of support that this kind of great relationship between okay, thanks. All right, now to get into things. Now, notions of sustainable development. And obviously, we have very simple versions of this, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The UN World Commission, one of the first major statements in this. And there's other versions of this, thinking about sustainability also in the context of the way we treat the environment, influences the way it treats itself and vice versa, this need for new lifestyles, and thinking about sustainability in terms of our own sort of quest for things, the common growth, the common good as it might be, making those choices and investments. And that's something that I think we'll continue to talk about for this week in terms of our own personal and social responsibility in terms of meeting a number of these issues with respect to world food problems. Where do we stand on these things? Particularly when it comes to trying to define a sustainable food system, now we all know it's a very delicate balance between needing to improve lifestyles and feeling the well-being on one hand, preserving those natural resources and ecosystems, and which we and future generations depend on the other hand. The real issue, of course, comes up here is how do you make a sustainable food system when people want to consume more meat? They're going through this rapid dietary transition. We see in the BRIC countries, in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, rapid dietary change. But is that done in such a sustainable way? But in the same hand, as we do not curb much of our own consumption patterns in the United States, and the waste atoms we know much more about, is the idea that, as Americans, we think about sustainable development, but yet when people in other countries are beginning to reach a certain level of, sort of in their economy, in economic development, that they're able to really afford now these sort of more luxury foods as might be, particularly when it comes to meat. It has incredible impact, as we know, on the ecosystem in terms of, like we saw one of the talks after lunchtime was about water, an incredible amount of water that goes into like beef production, which is huge. So how do we make this balance, particularly when we're talking about a sustainable food system, in which more and more of the world is demanding more and more, but what about their own rights to do that? And so we're going to get into some interesting things to think about, I think, this week when it comes to food policy and notions of sovereignty. I mean, do not these people from the global south, now emerging, especially emerging economies, have the same rights to consume as we do? And what's that mean for the future? So I think holistically, we know that the 2015 deadline is coming quickly. There was never the idea that all countries would even begin to meet these, but it was at least a beginning. And I like to look at this more just to remind ourselves that defeating global hunger is right up there at the top priority. And But it's linked to all these other factors, and I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves when we talk about global food problems, it has to be constantly in this context of issues of poverty, of education, of empowerment, gender empowerment, child mortality, maternal health, all infectious diseases, environmental sustainability, and ultimately, the last one there, development, a global partnership for development, where those developing nations can provide capacity building for many nations to try to essentially begin to meet these development goals. But right now at the UN, they're doing lots of discussions about what's the next revision, what's the next target date out there that we're going to try to meet. But it's also been important, I think, to see how countries, on one hand, have been trying to track their own internal kind of development challenges as well. But I think at least it keeps an open discussion, at least at the UN, to hear these things. One of the things I do at the UN is sit in for the Holy See on some of the conferences. I know Anita Spring I often see. She has a small NGO I see here there oftentimes as well. But when you listen to things going at the UN, it's often, you think nothing ever gets done there. But remember, they're not a legal body in terms of making laws. And I think American public often forgets that. They're just there to provide advice and guidance and provide support for countries to develop in their own way, sort of their own sovereign way. So obviously watching the U.S.'s position on things at the UN is disconcerting as a citizen, but I guess part of the democracy is I can have something to say about that, at least in terms of my own votes in life. But it was interesting alone just to see how, particularly watching the transition from the Bush to Obama administration, some things changed, but not much. And the American position just keeps rolling on. And that's sort of, so beyond the politics we hear in Washington, there's a larger American politics we have to also reconsider. And it comes back to questions of consumption and sort of sustainable development. In other words, we need to shake right at the core across the political spectrum, I think, in a lot of ways we think about the world food system. So really what I wanted to do today was introduce a number of things in the context of really definitional. So I tried to use highlighter or yellow highlighter to ultimately, got one here? All right, okay, that's so green. Is try to highlight some of the terminology so don't get lost in the words. But I think we all, fundamentally think about questions of social justice, the sort of rights-based approach in the context of food access. It's centered on notions of equitable systems of food distribution. It's the notion underlying social justice. It's clearly building a solidarity network that really guarantees the dignity of every human being at the bottom line. And that, of course, is the right to food. And there's lots of other terms that come along, whether we call it food justice, just food democracy, and we'll talk a little bit about food sovereignty. But overall, it's this sort of notion that access to safe and nutritious food is also, again, in solidarity with this larger framework, I think, that can be linked up with notions of environmental justice. So don't get too much caught up in definitions, because I know that this evening, in fact, Ellen Messer will take us deeply into the politics and also maybe work our way through notions of food rights in particular. But I just want to sort of give you this sort of introduction part to that, in part to set that up. This importance of having the right to regular, permanent, unrestricted access, either directly or means financial purchases, to quantitatively and qualitatively adequate and sufficient food corresponding to cultural traditions of people to which consumer belongs, and which ensure physical and mental individual collective fulfilling dignified life free of fear. Now that's, who else could come up with that with some kind of a human body? I know it's kind of a twisted set of words. But the bottom line is it's really met the notion of dignity and access. In fact, what I want to point out is the three main components of that without other details. As you boil it down, it's really a question of making sure that for food rights, that there's a question of availability. There needs to be an availability there in part. Whether that's from agriculture or hunters and gatherers or fishing, whatever it might be. But also secondly, a question of accessibility. That's both an economic and a physical access to be guaranteed in that context. And also then the question, the third A really is adequacy, that it can satisfy dietary needs. And that would include, as we heard last night from Sandra, the importance of even micronutrient is part of that. It's not just a matter of calories, right? It's a matter of a larger, diverse diet in and of itself. And there are also questions of food safety that would go along with that, the contaminants, both in industrial and agricultural processes, but it also should be ultimately, and we all appreciate this as anthropologists, is that be culturally acceptable. And what does that mean, especially in very pluralistic societies? How do you as a nation create a food rights declaration to make sure that you've covered the bases of the diversity, be that religious, cultural, ethnic, etc., within the community. Now, it's interesting because the UN in their Commission on Human Rights, particularly the Right to Food fact sheet, came out in 2010, says things that kind of, I think make us sit back and think of it, about, well, what is the right to food? And what I particularly wanted to point out was the right to food is not the same as the right to be fed. Okay, the right to food is not the right to be fed, but primarily the right to feed oneself in dignity. And we kind of parse that all out all day long, but what it's really trying to say is that, what's the government's responsibility? I mean, some people are like, oh, that's just they're going to hand free food out to people and that's their responsibility. Or is it a question of really availability, accessibility, and these other issues that came up in that earlier right to food? And to be honest, and I don't want to get sidetracked at this point because I'm sure it'll come later in the week about the Farm Bill, but the reason the House split the Farm Bill into a nutrition bill instead of a farm subsidy type bill is I think because of the politics behind that nutrition part of that, which sort of hits right to the head of this, about what's Americans' responsibility to have a food secure society or not, particularly with like SNAP benefits or what we used to call food stamps. And so this kind of gets you around that, because some people feel like food stamps are just feeding people. But is it really feeding people, or are you giving them other kinds of rights that are involved with that? At the same time, people often look at the right to food as something different from food security and food sovereignty as well. I mean, the concepts are somewhat different, but obviously there's a lot of overlap here. And if you look at the FAO notion of food security, all people have, again, physical, social, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious need that meets their dietary needs. Culturally appropriate, again, food preference for an active and healthy life. And I think that's an important part that I always like to emphasize is for a healthy and active life. And it's not just a matter of just, again, meeting the calorie needs, except for having a fulfilled life, an active, and quality one, healthy one. So in this way, you can see that food security is sort of a precondition, let's say here, for the enjoyment of the right to food is a precondition for that. But it also does not impose obligations on stakeholders, nor does it provide entitlements to them. You can see that the UN speak here is being very careful to try to make sure nations, on one hand, don't draw away from this, but feel like in some ways they have a way around it, as it might be, so they can sort of sign on to this without being fully held accountable. I guess that's what a lot of this ultimately means. And then this concept of food sovereignty, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on now. And again, from the UN perspective, very short and sweet, that promotes an alternative model for agriculture, trade policies, practices that serve people's rights to food, being safe, healthy, and adding to this sort of ecological, sustainable food production. And again, this right to food sovereignty is recognized under some national laws, but there's no international consensus on where that should be brought into that. And part of that is the history behind food sovereignty. I want to kind of redefine it again in the historical context of how food sovereignty has been used and conceptualized. And I've kind of seen this international peasants movement that launched this idea, coined the food sovereignty as a term at the World Food Summit in 1996. And so here it's the rights of people to a healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food systems. And that's sort of the short of it. And I think that includes those notions of the right to food in part, that it's healthy, it's culturally appropriate, but also it's adding to that this notion of looking at the larger food system that's produced in a sustainable way. And not only that, but more importantly, as a sovereign issue here, is that people have the right to define their own food systems. So what this sort of turns into is, you can see an emphasis is often then on a model of development, a sustainable development for food systems at a small scale, looking more at the local sustainable production, the benefits communities, and again, the environment and ecology, as you can consistently put into this. But it puts aspirations, needs, and livelihoods of those who produce, distribute, and consume the food at the heart of the food system, and policies rather than demands of markets and corporations. So you can see this sort of anti-corporate, in many ways, it's so sort of anti-globalization of the food system movement is what it's really become. But it tries to ensure the rights to this notion of sovereignty, of people's ability to manage their lands and territories, but also to manage their own water and seeds and livestock and biodiversity. Those should be in the hands of those people who are the producers, not the corporate sector. And you can see where this is going to the notion of sovereignty. It's not just a matter of growing what you want to grow, it's the whole system in which food is produced and consumed. And so the movement itself is looking at a very genuine agrarian reform about how we do agriculture in the world. Is really their priority as an ultimate, as a farmers movement. So I wanted to link to this notion of sovereignty in the question of looking at terms like and used in the context of environmental nutrition, which kind of puts together and emphasizes both the sort of ecosystem, ecological context of how food's produced, but also the nutritional side, so the biological need side of nutrition. And the way we see environmental nutrition often defined is it's optimizing health, so that the nutrition part's coming right out. It's looking at questions of health and promoting nutritious food and clean water as well from a secure, accessible, and sustainable food system. So sort of wrapping up these notions, we'll see other terms that are used and can be utilized that make sure they integrate the notions of health and ecology and rights. Now, it's defined as a sustainable and resilient food system that conserves and renews the natural resources. Clearly that's defined as a sustainable agricultural system, but it also advances social justice, animal welfare, fulfills the food and nutrition needs of all eaters now and in the future. So that's sort of where environmental nutrition is, looking at the nutritional side of these things in terms of not just having calories, but you can link this up to the next term I have here, are questions of dietary diversity, and what I like to think more emphasize dietary biodiversity. I think is the way we have to start thinking about this more and more. And that's this notion of access to and consumption of a wide spectrum of food products originating from within traditional, local, and or regional food systems or food environments. And this can also be linked to other terms that are being used now in sustainable agricultural movements of eco-health and agroecology. So a lot of developed work that goes into trying to create sustainable food systems, particularly in the global south, for example, are using and integrating these very more holistic ways of approaching development, especially in terms of food production at the small-scale small farmer holders, is notions like eco-health. So to decrease health disparities, improve health conditions through mechanisms that promote sustainable ecosystems. And when we tie that specifically with things like agroecology, an approach to sustainable agriculture that views arable regions, ecosystems, and concerned with the ecological impact of agricultural practices. So we taken together these very much overlap notions of agroecology, eco-health, environmental nutrition, and dietary biodiversity, but it really shows, I would say, in the last 10, 20 years, more and more ways of how people are looking at sustainable development in a very ecosystem, holistic way, looking at agriculture that way. I mean, obviously, you know, the biologists in the room have always thought about systems approach in sort of ecosystems, but to sort of take an ecosystem approach to doing agriculture is not exactly how the history of American agriculture, industrial agriculture actually came about. And we can talk about integrated pest management today, but that wasn't the thinking in the 1940s, nor was it even thinking much even during the Green Revolution, for example. And so really thinking about these integrated systems of the environment and agriculture. So what I wanted to really emphasize is this action-based approach to food justice really be realized in a system, again, using terms of social justice, of solidarity, that's built on these local and regional food production chains and food systems. I mean, no one expects community gardens to meet all the potential local food demands or dietary diversity needs in the future. I think this came up the other day, but Saul mentioned it as well. But, you know, obviously, we're still going to need things. I think it's some other session too. Not everything's going to be able to come local. We're still going to have this relationship with the world. But at the end of the day, when it comes to food production, I think we can strive to make it, of course, as local as possible. I mean, even in New York City, people say, oh, you can't grow enough food to feed New York City. Obviously, just by using rooftop gardens and urban agriculture. And, you know, there have been some interesting studies done at different centers, like at NYU, and they've shown that, well, in fact, you can. I mean, you could feed people within a 100-mile radius within New York City. Because you have to think of the acres and acres of lawns and unutilized land that's being churned up, for example. There is that possibility. I mean, think of the acres of land that are mowed every Saturday morning, just on Long Island, for example. I mean, that's thousands and thousands of acres of food, basically, that can be produced. But the real notion, I think, particularly in urban agriculture, is it gives, in its most effective way, of making people aware of and becoming actively engaged in their own food systems. I think that's the great thing about community activism around food, around having sort of community gardens, that, you know, are not going to produce a lot of food in the day, but the education value for the community is just, you know, you can't beat that. Because it gives a sense of awareness. It also helps in that sort of, you're not just learning about the garden, you're learning about being part of civil society, that you can be engaged, that you can make a change in your own neighborhood, ultimately, in terms of food policies, where grocery stores come and don't come. and ultimately these issues around food justice. But we all know that local small farming systems are the most nimble, able to adapt quickly, and that would be from Amazonia to Zambia. And this is not just in the US. I think that eating locally, again, a lot of naysayers about that and the possibility of that. But regardless of one trying to calculate out, food miles and all these other things that go into that, I just want to keep emphasizing that it is the best way to educate about the food system in this country. And that's why I think that if we look at these other issues I'm coming up to now, we have a globalization of world food production and consumption, and how well aware are people of those kinds of that system itself, and how deeply concerned should they be that impacts local food systems and sort of food chains. It impacts local food security, particularly in terms of the fluctuating prices that's going to show up at your local grocery store, and ultimately the health of communities and the health disparities we see, particularly in urban and very rural communities, both in the U.S. and abroad. And it's created these health disparities that link to, again, as we saw last night, Sandra did such an excellent job at laying out this double disease burden. I mean, we should be terrified that this is the future of the planet. I mean, we can talk about not being able to grow enough food or can, but what's being grown right now and consumed right now is going to lead to huge costs. And to put even more of a notion of this double disease burden of both under and over nutrition is how could a country that cannot even afford a system of antiretroviral treatments for HIV patients going to possibly be able to do dialysis? It's not going to happen. I mean, not until the cost of that is enormous even in the U.S. with those factors, let alone the global South, where these incidences are growing dramatically, ultimately. But, I mean, we can see that how do we come to this point? Again, Sandra shed some light on that last night, and I want to sort of reiterate the disruptions that we see then and that created this double disease burden is attributed in part to the policies that encouraged agricultural subsidies, discriminatory trade barriers, and very aggressive marketing of processed food and beverage products. We all know that and see how that basically has impacted not only the U.S. food system, but this is now impacting clearly a global food system. And it's further exacerbated by large-scale shifts in industrial agriculture, including the use of biotechnology, where monocropping, cash crop production strategies have led to the erosion of this dietary biodiversity, dietary diversity in really local food environments. And that's had a real impact, clearly, on people's ability to deal with infectious disease, or even now these emerging double disease burden, everything from micronutrient deficiencies and the like. So where you can just say, well, calories continue to increase, but the other aspect of diversity has been definitely undermined. So whether we look at this as the feast and famine, the global paradox of feast and malnutrition, I mean, we can kind of review from going from what Saul said in the sun to the green revolution, nutrition transition, this public health issue we're dealing with, that farmers produce enough food for everyone, but hunger still persists. What's going on with that? We're still looking at ways that technology can and cannot help us deal with this, how we wrestle with this. And I like this little point. This is actually from a Scientific American special issue from a few years ago, but the notion of food as medicine and how we deal with that kind of medicalization of things like obesity or food, and how we sort of struggle with that in part. So, this fluctuates back and forth, depending on the FAO, WHO numbers, but we're right at sort of 1 billion and 1 billion, so it's bouncing out. And that, it's not ironic, I think, that this double disease burden has come about because of this bouncing of those that are over and under nourished, in just terms of sheer numbers, for example. And, not to get into these numbers specifically, but, you essentially find that of the 1 billion overweight, 300 million then would be classified as obese by BMI, by mass index. So you have these type 2 diabetes, you have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke, certain forms of cancer, and every other metabolic thing that's going to go along with these things as well. But the key cause, I think, is clearly consumption of energy-dense foods, again, high saturated fats, sugars, and reduced physical activity. And these have created what we refer to sort of these obesogenic environments, and sort of the globalization of obesogenic environments is clearly the biggest concern. And here's just a quick sort of projecting into the future what we can find in terms of rates of diabetes. And you can see by looking here into 2030, you can see that high rates clearly in India, Southeast Asia, for example, are going to be the greatest growth. There's no doubt about that. The projections are clearly, they're already happening. In fact, I would imagine, Sanjay, you're probably very well aware of this, I'm sure that we don't have to wait till 2030. This is going to be happening in the next decade. This is going to happen by 2020, not even before that, which is even more and more scary, these issues. I just want to sort of highlight a couple of things that when we look at things like body mass index as an indicator of changes in consumption, changes in basically looking at the food environments change dramatically. Whether this was amongst the Pima we saw back in World War II, and I was going to add to some of the comments Saul said about that, the high rates of diabetes amongst the Pima in the American Southwest, is because what came in World War II were subsidies, and those subsidies were white flour, lard, basically, and sugar. And what do you make out of those three things? Fry bread. Fry bread. So you find that fry bread sort of symbolizes, in many ways, this change and more traditional to these sort of diets, these obesogenic environments, in addition to the sedentism and other things that are on. What I want to point out here, look, just pick some countries out, and it's surprising, I think, that although there was no data for a lot of things that Sandra showed us, because that's a whole other question why there's no data from South Africa, that you can see where there is data, it's amazing. If you look at the BMI, it's 67, it's approaching the high BMIs in South Africa, very similar to that of the US. Though we still see South Africa very much as sort of a global south. And the same thing with countries like Haiti, for example, where you have amongst females pretty high BMI rates. What's going on? And particularly, if you sort of pull apart, not only by country, but even within country, some of these things can start to come out by looking and sort of tracking and seeing the changes that have taken place in the food system, in the sort of environmental nutrition of these countries. For Haiti, it's simple. It's a matter of their entire rice production was just gutted by our own subsidies and cheap rice coming from the US. And that what came with that was an incredible, huge influx of highly processed foods and the like that came with that. Not to mention the other problems with Haiti, that's one other added burden, of course, is this double burden as well as everything else that's been impacting Haiti over the last decade or more. Now, I've highlighted both Zambia and Zimbabwe. They're formerly northern and southern Rhodesia, British colony, and why are the differences so great? I mean, look at overweight and obese in terms of looking at the females. You have 18.6% in Zambia, but 48.9% in Zimbabwe. Why such that big difference? What's going on there? And not that, a very large difference between that's 18.6 for females, and say, and this is just in BMI of 30. If you look over to males, it's 7.5, or it's like 48.9 to 15.3% difference between females and males. And having worked on Zambia on other issues, I saw this, why is it so different from Zimbabwe? Well, on one hand, Zimbabwe, besides having several, tens of thousands of percent of inflation and a huge sort of transition in its own government, very fluctuating and volatile government, to say the least, depending heavily on food aid, and obviously that food aid is very much restricted and sort of controlled by the government and the same president they have to this day. But also this huge influx, it seems a bit, of a lot of processed foods, both through food aid, bringing the calories in, and other processed foods as well. But still, I just scratched my head and said, yeah, that's going on in Zambia too. I think it was a difference in political systems and shifting post-colonial to why is that difference there? Then I looked at the data a little closer and started, well, it actually varies substantially when you look across the country. So if you look, for example, in urban areas like Harare in Zimbabwe, or you look at Lusaka in Zambia, these two capital cities, actually they're almost the same between the two countries. What you find then is, for example, in Zambia, if you go to the western region, the very dry region on the border of Angola, the rates are more like down like 7% or 5%. If you go into the more northeast region of Zambia, which is close on the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a very more tropical system, guess what? The rates are more like 7. So I think what's interesting to see is not only in urban environments, for example, where the rates were more like 30 or so, is the importance of this thing, data just based on BMI, is important to understand, I think, not only historically the transition these countries have gone in, but even today to try to understand where can we maybe intervene in this food system? Why do we have such high rates in certain localities within countries, be it urban or sort of certain regions within these countries ultimately? And I'm just pointing this out because I think for a lot of work that's dealing with interventions in terms of reducing, I know it seems odd to talk, we're going to reduce obesity in places like Zambia. I think if I told my students that, they'd go, isn't that in Africa? Isn't that like, sub-Saharan Africa? Don't they have all this food aid going there? And we're talking about obesity? What's going on with that? But I think it's useful both as a lesson to sort of pull apart within country there's differences, but I think it's also important to understand this is an indicator of a massive change in food systems that are ongoing right now, the BMI itself. But also, if you look at something that may seem even more esoteric at first, but actually has a lot of meaning to it, is all the major commodities are very well outlined in terms of the tonnage that comes in and out of countries or imported. But there's also this category that sort of links together all the sort of prepared and processed food commodities. It's called not elsewhere specified, but just basically it's not rice or corn or soybeans or things like that. And you can see that in some of these same countries, like in Zambia and Zimbabwe back then, these several 100% increases. And look at Haiti, an 1,800% increase in the importation of these highly processed foods between 94 and 2004. And it doesn't surprise us that, there's correlation and causation, but I think if one look deeply at these numbers, there is something going on here in terms of just the numbers of the amount of import of these processed foods that we know are linked within our own society, these changes in the food system and changes that are adding and contributing to this double disease burden we ultimately see. Now, obviously we could talk all day about corporate marketing and how savvy they are and just penetrating into every market possible, and Coke is really king of that. I mean, just this terminology, this is from a 2006 annual report, but think locally, refresh globally. I mean, think about that. It's telling a lot. The idea is that you should refresh globally with the Coca-Cola company. Everyone should be drinking a Coke product, of which there are thousands of them, and they create 300 to 500 a year, for example, new products. They basically go into any local community around the planet, and we talk about water issues, that's a whole other topic, but they basically go and they look at local drinks. They modify them, and they package them and ultimately sell them. But the thinking locally is that they argue, well, we're giving people locally, opportunities. We're opening up, we locally produce this stuff, we locally bottle this stuff. But the reality is, well, what's that linked to? And what's the larger food system transition that's going to go with drinking incredibly high amounts of with the liquid candy, you could call it, or ultimately things that are high in empty calories at the end of the day. But there's also this kind of countervalence that we constantly struggle with between the food industry and drink industry. And you may not be able to read this, but I'll read it, and we all recognize the generic label from the past. And it basically says, you might be surprised to learn who thinks about your child's nutrition as much as you do. Many guesses to what company this might be that's deeply concerned about your child's nutrition. I'm loving it, yeah. McDonald's is a company. So I mean, they're playing all sides, and I think in different talks already that I've just listened to the last couple of days, this comes up both in the food and drink industry with respect to, if you're one of these large multinational food companies like Kraft, General Foods, for example, you're going to provide every kind of health-related, health-providing food. If you want to go along that track for healthy eating, at the same time, you can provide everything that's creating the unhealthy environment as well. And you're playing both sides of that at the end of the day. And I want to throw in just to sort of, and other things that are coming up, I know, in the talks, is questions of consumption and waste. And just want to bring this up a little bit. This is a recent, World Environment Day. Consumerism has led us to become used to an excessive daily waste of food. This is clearly talking about, Pope Francis talking really about not the West, both Western Europe and the US in particular, but I think it would now fit a lot into what we see happening in the global South, particularly these double disease burden. But so the notion of sort of throwing food away is like stealing from the table of the poor, the hungry. That's a very strong statement, and obviously I think Pope Francis will come out with stronger statements in the future. But the idea here is to think about how we recycle these things. I know the EPA, we're going to hear a lot more about some food waste challenges and other things as we go through the week. But I just wanted to bring that notion up because with consumption comes that waste. So with the overconsumption, with the change in the food system is coming a great deal of waste at the same time. And so it's like, not only is it overconsumption, it's overconsumption with a lot of waste on top of that. So it's really waste. Think of it as over the top at the end of the day. Okay, I want to just hit upon this notion of environmental nutrition again and its relationship to adaptation and respect to obesogenic environments. And when Saul had introduced this notion that if we think about ourselves as a species, we're trapped in this, you say, Paleolithic body adapted genetically to a foraging lifestyle, it's hunters and gatherers. And people always argue that the shift then has led us, that went to the path of agriculture and becoming sedentary, and eventually industrialization of the food supply, has led to diet-related health problems we now face. And I wanted to add some of what Saul was saying, is we have to realize that the domestication process, it just didn't happen overnight. And I know Saul had sent this stuff years ago, how barley was re-domesticated again and again and again. It's like Kickstarter, every few centuries it'd start up again. And people often say, well, 10, 12,000 years, suddenly we knew how to deal with animals and plants. I mean, I hate to tell us this, but I think people knew a lot about animal and plant behavior even before our own species. They knew exactly how things happen. So it was other choices were being made there, ultimately. It wasn't just like a eureka, we figured out how to domesticate this plant. People through fire ecology and helping on plants and culling livestock herds, wild herds, was happening for tens of thousands of years before we got to the point of domestication. But whenever we finally got to that point where there was no return, ultimately, the centuries and millennia that came later, we clearly are facing that now. We were clearly, ultimately, at least genetically adapted to that lifestyle. So, there's been a lot of discussion lately, you would think, about Paleolithic diets. No. I mean, from the 19th century onward, people have been talking about how we should eat as an ape, as a human, and what we're destined to eat. Basically, you can see here, this is, guess what? This is from these, not surprisingly, right? A cereal advertisement. Okay. Eat like a cave woman, be slim and radiant. This is from 1931. So we've always been sort of trapped in this notion of trying to figure out, well, who are we? What are we meant to eat? What sort of thing that humans are supposed to eat? And obviously, as anthropologists, we often get this question, well, what's a human really supposed to eat? And we can get to the omnivore side and talk about that a bit, but or even in terms of what we're supposed to eat, I think links to a larger question that Saul was bringing up. It's an ethnivore question. Because what we eat is just a matter of what we need to eat. What we eat becomes sort of deeply embedded in the myths and traditions of our own cultures and societies. We say, what should we eat? So it's not just strictly a nutrition question, it's also a question of these other traditions that go along with that. Now, Sandra had laid out quite nicely this notion of a Barker hypothesis, but I only want just to reiterate this again because this really is back to this kind of adaptation as hunters and gatherers. What's also referred to as a thrifty phenotype, this ability to be able to conserve. But if you look at it in terms of adaptation, with impaired nutritional status of the mother during pregnancy will lead to uterine growth disruptions and low birth weight in a child who's better adapted to chronic food shortages. Well, they're not better adapted in lots of other ways and clearly are impacted in their own growth and development. But from a strictly survival perspective, sure. It's an amazing evolutionary adaptive strategy to have this happen. Just to make sure the pregnancy goes to term and there's child survival. Now, the nature of the quality of life of that child, et cetera, is what we find today. So the impact on everything from cognitive development and these other kind of developing diseases that will come earlier in life than they should ultimately. But the idea is that, problematic to this, as we saw last night, if the child develops in, we could say, sort of a more energy-rich environment, at least, or we call it obesogenic, but a more affluent food system, they're more likely to develop diabetes and all these other chronic diseases that Sandra had laid out so nicely last night. And with the rapidly changing food environments, it's going to, even before the age of 10, and now after hearing Sandra's talk, I'm going to keep ratcheting this down, which is even more depressing. As she said, it gets into younger and younger ages too, as you mentioned, for example. So, but it's this notion of adaptation. And although better, of course, adapted to chronic food shortages, obviously they're going to suffer from other issues down the road. But I also want to link up just briefly again to reiterate this notion of the epigenetic factors. And the notion of epigenetics is clearly revolutionizing the way we not only think about adaptation, growth, and development, but we still have, particularly anthropologists, we have yet to sit down and rethink the entire evolution of our species in epigenetic terms. I mean, it's so simple, genomics, DNA, we kind of go through this stuff, but now it's all changing. The notion of very flexible behavioral systems that are linked into things that aren't changing the genome and the DNA code, but they're definitely changing the ability for that code to be realized in terms of expressed, for example. And this is where a lot of interesting research is looking back at things like population-based health disparities. Why do we find such high rates of hypertension in African American communities? You know, in the past, and same thing, why do we find such high rates of diabetes amongst Native Americans? In the past, it's always going to a genomic question. Well, there must be some genetic sequence in Native Americans, particularly making them susceptible. Well, the reality is for all these major diseases, guess what? This is genetics of what? Our species. It's our species genome. But whether that's realized or not becomes back to this environmental impact, an epigenetic impact of maybe decades, if not centuries, of adapting to different kinds of social, economic conditions. So that's only trying to explain these health disparities. So kind of these biocultural linkages between the epigenetic environments and the nutrition transition itself, I think we're going to find more and more about, particularly as we see why are certain groups, for example, in South Asia, more rapidly changing than others. Is it a question of genomics, or is it a question of these larger term, maybe epigenetic factors involved with that? But really, I think, puts us at a critical juncture of understanding things like environmental nutrition, adaptation, and how we can approach questions of food policy and development, this kind of biocultural interface of our own human agency and action and biology. And it forces, I think, to really closely consider these moral and spiritual dimensions of our own food choices and consumption patterns. So, you know, what are the ethics of eating, and how do we consider ethical eating itself when we think about these linkages and these transitions ultimately here? And I'm just showing this because this is sort of conceptualized, and this still kind of have wrapped my head around this, is that when you think of the exposure of the mother is really can be impacting her grandchildren. As you can see there, the mother's first generation, second generation fetus, but there's also the reproductive cells in the third generation being formed at the same time. And just to try to think about that, our thinking is barely beyond 2 generations, but think about 3 generations. The impact of food policies, of interventions of micronutrients or not, especially during perinatal care, it's having a huge impact on generations that haven't been born yet. So that kind of relationship and understanding, I think, really sort of puts the pressure on for us to be, I guess, more urgent, as it might be, in trying to combat this double disease burden and everything that goes along with that. And as was mentioned last night, these mice. And the hope of this, I didn't want to seem all doomsday about it, is that we do find that even sort of micronutrient supplementation is a way in which these gene expressions can be shut off and other things can be turned on. And there is an ability for that environmental influence that can be very positive. Not that it's a panacea to everything, but we do find that there is that opportunity out there for intervention that can have a real impact on stopping some of these things that we see are maybe genetic related, but only expressed in the context of not having the proper supplementation or dietary interventions that are possibly out there. So back to Saul's ethnovore, I was thinking about this more last night. The ethnovore's biocultural dilemma. I thought about the ethnovore's dilemma, like the omnivore's dilemma, but I had to put in biocultural, especially knowing Saul. I had to, I think, have that extra added to that. But just show this link between the sort of indigenous knowledge, the system that's out there, the food, myth, ritual, tradition, but also this notion of the environmental nutrition, so the impact on the human body, sort of the measurable impact as it might be, and everything going on between that, between this genomic structures and the epigenome itself that are very flexible to adaptation, and how this is linked to a larger sort of food system. I didn't put any specific example in that, but just trying to make sure that the broad spectrum from indigenous knowledge, which would include, of course, the myth, the ritual, the traditions, the sacred, the secular, all within that, but at the same time thinking about its impact, particularly the environmental nutrition aspect of that, and how the changing environments are changing in a way that's shifting not only one's epidemiological transition going on, or public health indicators, but things are also going on in that knowledge system. And what's being lost or gained and changed in that knowledge system, I think, is important, as important of research question and policy question, as is the question of just the number of calories and micronutrients at the same time. So, kind of thinking this as a policy to action informed by tradition thing, I was thinking these larger spheres, particularly given the nature of this conference, there's a sacred food, there's a trust, the nature of how we view food and relate ourselves to food, so the sacred food trust. There's also very linked to sort of laws, legislation of a public social trust that's out there. But also the elephant in the room there, especially particularly putting in the red, is a corporate. We mean that in the sense of corporate incorporations, not just of the body, but a corporate responsibility. And that's what is the multinational food industry's responsibility and linkages with the sacred food trust and public social trust at the end of the day. How do those relate to each other? And I think that's a discussion that has to be had. I think it's a discussion that involves food policy has to be informed by tradition, so it's sacred food trust, but also by the public social trust of tradition, the politics, economics of food systems, but also always going to be there's corporate responsibility, because that's no doubt, I mean, I don't think we could go into this, we could go into this all day, is the impact of advertising, the impact of hitting that, I guess Sanders, but the bliss spot, I'd say sort of that sweet spot where you've got people tasting it and they want that thing, and you've created that sort of in your own food science labs at your food company. And but what responsibility do they have then to these, not only direct health problems in their own country, but also as a global phenomenon? So it's a responsibility that goes beyond our own policies in the U.S. further to that. And I want to sort of wind things up a bit by just saying that, you know, we always think of approaches to any kind of food policy, particularly whether it's domestic or maybe international, whether it's the Farm Bill or some other policy decision that takes place at the UN, for example, is we always think you've got a problem, you've got to solve it, right? There's a need, you've got to deal with that. But I think we realize more and more that, you know, problems are complex. And I always like to think it's more a question of a challenge. You've got to meet the challenge, negotiate it, revise it, so recommendations and actions taken. It's really the importance in anthropologists, we've realized this for a very long time in looking at adaptation to these different systems, is how people cope. And it's the most insightful understanding of understanding of what changed, but how people cope is important. Because it's in that, there's a shift from the need assessment these days in the development world to strength assessments. Let's not start out saying, what do they need, or here's what they need. It's a question of, what do people already have that they can build upon? It's the strength assessment. And just that, you know, shift itself has incredible impact on the success of most development programs. This is an asset inventory. You start out with that. That's the positive. You know, what's the advantage? What's the assets? What's the strengths people have in the community? And then you go from there to what can be built upon. Because we've gone far too long, and the Green Revolution is an example of that, I think, of just saying, there's a problem, this is what people need. Without sort of full discussion of like appropriate technology and, you know, what's really is needed in this community. And I just wanted to give this notion of all the work that's done by Catholic Relief Services. You know, it's one of the, well, Dim and World Vision are the two biggest recipients of USAID funding in terms of projects around the world. CRS works in about 100 different countries, so they're not just a relief service, they still do a lot of that, but they're clearly also focused on questions of development and really trying to work with not their own kind of coming in with their own people, but working with local partners. So they've devised this integral human development model. You can see just by the name itself, it's really based in Catholic social teaching, but this is a model in which you're looking at sort of the shocks, the cycles, the trends, outcomes, and strategies. They use this in every project, or they're asked to look at this model for every development project they do in whatever country that might be, just to think through the relationship of the structures and systems. But what's unique about this, which I find so important though, is that it includes a spiritual and human capital to that. It's an asset. And really trying to, you know, as anthropologists, definitely appreciate this notion that you have to look at any asset, not only in terms of physical, natural, financial, political, social, but you have to look at the spiritual and human assets. And that's something I want to think more, I'm going to be thinking more about this week, is sort of how does one tap into that sort of spiritual and human and ethic asset itself to really sort of move along to more civic engagements, the civil action, these important factors, to sort of address these more global issues of these sort of unequal systems of distribution and these changes and their impact of these changes in world food systems. So they use this as a conceptual framework. I'll jump ahead of that and just say that the way they sort of link this up with this notion of Catholic social teaching, the CST, is envisions a world where people can live their full potential, meeting basic physical needs sustainably, live with dignity and just and peaceful society. It's based on the rights relationship, and the keys are this holistic interhuman development promotes the good of every person, the whole person, in these various dimensions, the good and spiritual, promotes the integrity of creation. It's in solidarity, rights and responsibilities of each person, every person and one another. There's justice and peace. Equal human development promotes this sort of the dignity again of each person. So they're really looking at these development projects, even though the USAID funded a project, but the way they sort of implement these is they're trying to make it holistic as possible and not sort of, you know, stepping away from or maybe avoiding or not, you know, jumping right into the fact that, you know, it's always more than politics and economics. You have to look at these other dimensions. that would come along of dignity and solidarity. You can say like things like subsidiarity. But it's not meant to completely, be the magic bullet. It's not to replace good development practitioner, things like that. And I want to end it with just an experience in Brazil, in this new community called Nova Conquista. I wanted to talk about how you get food sovereignty in action. This is the CRS Project. I'm bringing this up. Northeastern Brazil, they just established this amazing community. They just built 30 houses. They got 2,670 acres. The Brazilian government, they're still fighting about sections of that from other land grabbers, but still. The unique dimension is that this is comprised of men who have been once victims of forced labor, basically enslaved, and their families. So they're essentially able to, through the different organizations like the Pastoral Land Commission, for example, or CPT, were able to sort of help contact the government. And the government has these teams that come in, like SWAT teams, to sort of free these people from they're way out in the Amazon. And what they're doing, of course, is they're altering food systems, and this is linked to us. I mean, they're either doing things like pig iron, which shows up in your automobiles. This is all through forced slave labor. They're deforesting areas, huge areas of tropical rainforest for either soybeans or for cattle, ultimately, too. And so this ends up in our own food supply distribution chain. It becomes a real question of the value of the food chain, the value of the food system as it comes to us, so its origins. So I know there's been more of a movement towards that. We often talk about fair trade, but this even goes deeper than that. There's one thing about working conditions, and there's working conditions that are completely inequitable and sort of, again, verge and go into this notion of slavery. But the notion of the sovereignty is now they're able to make decisions as a community, what they want to grow, kind of how they want to go about that. They're deeply concerned about climate change, for example, as a community. They're seeing the drought. They're wondering what's going to be the future of this. They can heavily rely on Antioch. This is the northeast part of Brazil, not far from Teresina, which is a region where, manioc, or also known as cassava, you can put other names, but there's dry versions of this. The bitter version can grow in incredibly poor tropical soils, but very dry condition. So that's still a livestock. But they're still trying to do dryland rice, and grow some corn, things like that. But they also want to, through sort of food sovereignty, make sure, sort of in cooperation as a community, they want to build their own school, they want a health clinic. But I was going to say that, so at the center of everything they're doing is they're trying to create a new sustainable food system anchored in notions of food sovereignty. And the Brazilian government is on for that. There's a lot of paperwork, but at least as a government, they're there to support these people. So I think that's a model, because, in talking to several of these individuals when I was there just last month, they basically, all we want is a piece of land. And I think that's what I'm going to end with, because that's simply what the smallholder farmers of the world want. It's just their own plot of land. Just to have enough for their family, very small scale. They're not looking to become rich. They want to have a fulfilled life of being able to be a farmer and not have to be a migrant worker for the future. So thank you.
We have one sound system today. I think that it's 10:35. The question is, I think it would be great if we had a few minutes of questions and then have the break for the picture and for getting coffee after the picture, I think, would be, or before, whatever you would like. But you need to know that the picture will be taken. If you're drinking a cup of coffee in here, you won't get one. But I just wanted to thank you very much for this challenging talk, and thank you for extending what I ought to have said yesterday, but in addition to that, for integrating this in new ways. And it's very exciting personally just to view these slides and understand where you've been able to take what you've been doing. And I should have also pointed out that Barry and I have been linked for about 30 years or so now, in starting in Hopi and moving out in many, many different directions and many different projects. So I wanted you to know that, and I should have said that initially. I think that the issues are many. You've raised a really important set of questions and challenges for all that we've been talking about. So are there some key issues that you'd like to raise? We only have one. Maybe we do have another microphone. Can we get this microphone turned back on so that we can have people talking into the microphone too? Thank you. I'm going to turn this one over to you. Yeah, there we go. Get this one back on.
3 weeks ago, I and Brian Check, who spoke here last year, met with a Roman Catholic group in Washington as part of this network that you referenced.